She was wrongfully sent to prison after being convicted of murdering her husband. Then one day, while calling her best friend, she made a shocking discovery.
Daddy!
Nick?
Her husband, the man who was supposed to be dead, was now living with her best friend. The call was abruptly disconnected, and when she tried again, she could no longer get through. She stood frozen in place, her mind completely blank. Then a horrifying thought hit her. Her husband had never died. He had planned the entire thing himself, faking his death, framing her for his murder, collecting a $2 million insurance payout, and running off with her best friend. It all started several months earlier. Today, we're covering the crime mystery thriller Double Jeopardy. This movie brought a little-known American legal principle into the spotlight. I'll keep exactly what that principle is under wraps for now, but you'll find out soon enough. Now, enough talk. The movie opens with Libby and Nick hosting a charity party at their seaside home, where the crowd is buzzing and the drinks are flowing. A beautiful woman carrying a little boy approaches the hostess. Libby, it is Angie, Maddie's preschool teacher and Libby's close friend, bringing the boy to see his mother. After the party ends and the guests leave, Libby and her handsome husband, Nick, cuddle together on a beach chair. Just then, Angie walks over carrying a glass of red wine. Nick and Angie have a surprise for Libby. She closes her eyes, and when she opens them again, a brand new sailboat is waiting in front of her. Nick says he is taking her away for a romantic weekend alone, while Angie looks after their son. Everything seems perfect. The sailboat glides into the bay, and the couple has a wonderful time that night. But when Libby wakes up, her nightmare begins. There is blood on her nightgown and her hands, with more blood covering the cabin walls, windows, and deck. Nick has vanished without a trace. Terrified, she picks up a knife lying on the deck. At that exact moment, the Coast Guard arrives and orders her to drop the weapon immediately. Once they return to shore, the search turns up nothing. The water was only 51 degrees Fahrenheit that night, and no one could have survived in such cold conditions. Several days later, Nick's lawyer friend arrives at the shore with the police and formally declares him dead, but the authorities rule his death a murder.
You're being formally charged with his murder, and I'm here to advise you, make no statements whatsoever to the sheriff.
Got her. Not in front of my kid, okay?
Libby can endure any accusation, but she cannot let her son watch his mother being taken away. All the key evidence points directly at her. Nick had been on the verge of bankruptcy and had even embezzled company funds. Just a few months earlier, the couple had also taken out enormous life insurance policies. With Nick dead, all their problems would disappear, and Libby would receive a $2 million payout. In court, everyone claims that she killed him for the money.
I didn't kill my husband. I love my husband. Mommy, I did not kill my husband!
She protests until her voice gives out, but no one believes her. To keep her son from becoming an orphan, she begs Angie to adopt Maddie and transfers the entire $2 million payout into a trust in his name.
It isn't about money. Maddie loves you. We can't let him become a ward of the state.
She makes her son a promise.
And as soon as all this is over, we'll be together again. That's a promise, kiddo. I love you.
I love you too.
But she has no idea that this will be the worst decision of her life. After Libby goes to prison, Angie frequently brings Maddie to visit her. Libby watches her son grow day by day, from babbling his first words to learning how to sing. But several months later, Angie and Maddie stop coming. Libby cries every night because she misses her son and cannot understand why they have disappeared. One of her cellmates, a former attorney, finally snaps her out of it. People do not simply vanish, so Libby needs to use her head. An idea suddenly comes to her. Pretending to be Angie, she calls the preschool where Angie used to work and says she has not received her severance pay in a long time and wants to verify her address. The person on the other end unsuspectingly gives her Angie's new address and phone number. Libby calls immediately. When Angie answers, she sounds nervous and claims that she had been planning to visit Libby that week. But Libby didn't want to hear any excuses and only wanted to hear her son's voice. When Maddie comes to the phone and speaks,
Hi, Mommy.
Oh, how are you, Maddie?
tears stream down Libby's face. Then she hears the most devastating words of her life.
Daddy.
Nick?
The realization hits her like a bolt of lightning. Her husband is not only alive, but he and Angie have also stolen her child, her freedom, and her entire life. And Libby is trapped inside a prison cell, unable to do anything. She tries telling the insurance company that her husband is still alive, but no one believes her. Her cellmate explains that overturning a conviction from prison would take years, and 95% of those attempts fail. She might as well serve out her sentence, find Nick after her release, and shoot him. That is because American law says a person cannot be tried twice for the same crime. If Libby has already served time for killing the same man once, the law cannot prosecute her again if she gets out and kills him for real. Prison has just handed her a legal license for revenge. From that day forward, Libby changes, while the other inmates smoke. She trains her core, while they rest. She runs through the rain. Hatred becomes her fuel, and her son becomes her reason to stay alive. 6 years pass, and Maddie is now 8 years old. Libby is granted parole for good behavior and moves into a halfway house in the city, where she will remain under a parole officer's supervision for 3 years. The rules are strict. She cannot fight, and she has to report back by 8:30 every night. Breaking even one rule will send her straight back to prison, but Libby does not care about the rules. She cares about only one thing: finding the man who betrayed her and reclaiming everything that should have been hers. Libby knows that to find her son, she first has to locate Angie. She visits the director of the preschool where Angie once worked, hoping to get her address, but the director tells her that Maddie and Angie have been living together for 6 years. If Libby suddenly reappears now, she will disrupt the boy's life and cause him pain. The director refuses to reveal anything, but Libby cannot wait. That night, under the cover of darkness, she wraps her arm and smashes the preschool window with her elbow. Meanwhile, her parole officer discovers that she has failed to return to the halfway house. They had suspected all along that finding her son would be the first thing Libby did after getting out. She breaks into the records room, pulls Angie's file, and finally finds her address. But just then, the police arrive. The conditioning Libby built during 4 years of training in prison now comes into play. She moves with incredible agility, vaulting through windows, leaping over obstacles, and sprinting away without missing a beat. The police chase her by car all the way to the shore. She hides behind some tree roots and cleverly evades them. But in the end, officers close in from both sides and cut off her escape.
What are you doing here?
For violating parole, Libby is handcuffed in the back seat of a police car and prepared for transport back to prison. She desperately tries to explain that she is innocent, but why would a parole officer believe a convicted husband killer? Libby happens to notice a picture of her parole officer's daughter. A convicted killer spends every day missing her child, while the officer keeps avoiding his own daughter. The police car is parked aboard a ferry when the parole officer steps out to get some air. Libby notices that the keys are still in the ignition. She presses the gas pedal with her foot and repeatedly rams the car backward and forward. By accident, she knocks the red car in front of them into the bay.
That's right.
She then continues trying to free herself from the handcuffs. Just then, the parole officer finally sees what she is doing. Libby floors the gas pedal, and the officer charges over to stop her. But as soon as he climbs into the car, it surges forward, sending both of them and the police cruiser into the water. Fortunately, the windows are open, with their lives on the line. The officer quickly unlocks Libby's handcuffs. The instant her hands are free, Libby grabs his gun and lets the water's buoyancy carry her out through the window. When the officer tries to grab her, she turns and strikes him with the gun. At that moment, neither the law nor morality matters to her as much as her son. She takes a deep breath, dives underwater, and swims in the opposite direction. On the surface, a life ring keeps the officer afloat while everyone stares at him. Only one boy turns toward the distant shore, where Libby has successfully escaped. She catches a ride and returns to the home she has not seen in years. Her mother makes a living growing tomatoes, She asks no questions and quietly digs up an aluminum box buried in the vegetable garden. Inside is every dollar she has managed to save. She gives the money to Libby and lets her take the family's little green car when it matters most. A mother will always be the strongest person in your corner. Libby walks into a car dealership and pretends that she wants to finance a vehicle. She deliberately gives the salesperson Angie's social security number. After checking the records, the salesperson begins questioning her.
20 Oriole Terrace, Evergreen, Colorado. Is that your current address?
20 Oriole Terrace, Evergreen, Colorado? Sure is.
Didn't you say your name is Angela Green? Because this says it's Angela Ryder.
Oh, no, I said Ryder.
Once Libby successfully coaxes the address out of him, she turns around and leaves. Meanwhile, her parole officer also tracks down Angie's address. His reasoning is simple. If he gets there first, he can wait for Libby to show up. But Libby is faster than everyone. She readies her gun and heads straight for the mansion, which Angie and Nick may have bought with the $2 million insurance payout. She presses the doorbell, but the person who answers is not Angie. The homeowner tells Libby that she has only recently moved in and suggests asking the elderly woman next door. The neighbor tells her that Angie died 3 years earlier in an explosion caused by a gas leak. Fortunately, the boy's father had taken him out that day, so they both escaped the blast. Libby finds an old newspaper carrying the story of Angie's death. Only Libby knows that Nick must have done it. He has silenced Angie too. The parole officer later finds the elderly neighbor, but once again, he is too late. He learns that Libby drove away in a little green car. Libby studies the newspaper over and over until she suddenly notices a painting hanging on the wall behind Angie. It is a Kandinsky that Nick once owned. Following this clue, Libby finds an art gallery and pretends that she wants to buy a painting so she can inspect the Kandinsky sales records. While the gallery owner searches for the information, the parole officer spots the little green car and follows Libby inside. The doorbell rings, and the owner steps away to greet the customer. Libby takes advantage of the brief opening, quickly finds the painting's sales information, and slips out through the back door. Before leaving, she also rams the parole officer's car and totals it, making it much harder for him to keep following her. Libby boards a plane for New Orleans. Following the address of the person who sold the painting, she arrives at a hotel hosting a bachelor auction. A server tells her that the hotel's owner will be there that night. After leaving the hotel, Libby sets her sights on a 5-star hotel.
Has a view?
Your room has a lovely view from Mississippi, Mrs. Scratch.
And I need a masseuse.
I'll send Jerome right up. Bruce, 1420.
She quietly memorizes the conversation of a wealthy woman at the front desk, then turns and walks into the clothing boutique next door. The salesperson looks her up and down.
So I've got something for tonight, but I think I need Armani.
Yes. Very good, Mrs.
Critch, Suite 1420.
Of course.
But Libby is no longer the weak, helpless wife she used to be. 6 years in prison and 4 years of training have taught her how to observe, disguise herself, and make use of every resource available. Step by step, she is closing in on the man who destroyed her life. And this is only the beginning. Her parole officer also reaches New Orleans. Because he has no authority to enforce the law there, he has to ask the local police for help. But he does not know that Libby is already one step ahead of him and has entered the hotel. Tonight is New Orleans' annual bachelor auction. The first man to step onto the auction stage is named Jonathan Devereaux. But when the spotlight hits his face, Libby freezes. The man standing there is unmistakably Nick. The women in the audience begin bidding, and the price quickly rises from $500 to $5,000.
$5,500.
Will the lady take us to 6?
$10,000.
We'll see. Unless someone who knows.
One woman hidden in the crowd keeps raising the bid. When everyone looks around to see if anyone will go higher, the competitor calmly says to forget it because Jonathan Devereaux is not worth the money. The moment she finishes speaking, Libby steps out of the crowd. Nick is completely stunned. He thought she was still in prison, so he cannot understand how she could possibly be here. The two leave the stage together, and Libby makes only one demand. She wants her son back. Nick hurriedly explains that 6 years earlier, He had been on the verge of bankruptcy. He claims that he only meant to fake his suicide so Libby could collect the insurance money and build a happy life with their son. He supposedly never imagined that she would go to prison because of it. As for Angie, Nick claims that the two of them did not get together until later. He says the entire thing has been a nightmare and that leaving Libby was the worst thing he ever did. But Libby does not want to hear another word, take his money, or accept any other compensation because all she wants is her son. Just then, she spotted her parole officer approaching, so she turned to leave and told Nick she would contact him the next day. The next day, the officer finds Nick. After a little small talk, he bluntly asks why Libby bid on him at the auction.
Excuse me for a second. Yes. This is a business call.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Nick sends the officer away by claiming that he has business to discuss. The call is from Libby. She tells Nick to meet her at the cemetery at 4 that afternoon and bring their son with him. That afternoon, Libby met Nick at a busy public cemetery. From a distance, she sees the boy she has dreamed about every day for 6 years.
Maddie? Maddie?
Maddie is finally right in front of her. She approaches him one step at a time, but the boy keeps backing away. After 6 years apart, her son no longer recognizes her and treats her like a stranger. She follows the boy deep inside a mausoleum. But just then, Nick suddenly appears from behind and slams into her, knocking her unconscious. He opens the nearest coffin, throws Libby inside, and locks the lid. Afterward, the boy runs over to Nick. It turns out that he is only a young actor Nick paid to play Maddie. The whole thing has been another trick. At the police station, the parole officer suddenly realizes that something is wrong. Why was Libby so determined to find Jonathan Devereaux? He calls a colleague and asks for Nick's driver's license photo, and the truth begins coming to light. Meanwhile, Libby wakes up inside the coffin. In the darkness, her body is pressed against the remains of a stranger. She repeatedly flicks her lighter, and its faint glow illuminates the sealed coffin. She pushes and kicks with all her strength, but the lid does not budge. However, in his haste, Nick made one fatal mistake. He forgot to search her. Libby pulls out her gun, holds her breath, and aims at the coffin's lock. Her first shot punches a small hole through one locking point. She locates the second lock and fires again. The coffin finally opens, and she climbs out. The mausoleum's iron gate is locked, but fortunately, there is a window. Libby climbs through it and emerges into daylight. 6 years earlier, her husband sent her to prison, stole the insurance money, and ran off with her best friend. She had tried to let it go, but kindness only made her an easier target. Now she has to make Nick pay. She heads straight for Nick's hotel, but just as Libby is about to walk through the entrance, her parole officer uncovers the truth. Jonathan Devereaux was really Nick. He finally believes that Libby was wrongfully imprisoned. She is not a murderer, but simply a desperate mother trying to find her son. He stops Libby and enters the hotel himself to speak with Nick. Inside Nick's office, the officer gets straight to the point. He makes it clear that he knows Jonathan Devereaux's true identity. He is Nick Parsons, the man who faked his death 6 years earlier, changed his name, and built a new life in New Orleans. Nick is a smart man. He knows that if the officer has not called the police, he must be looking for a deal. Nick tries to stall for a few days, but the officer refuses to give him any time. If Nick does not pay, the police will be called immediately. Nick reluctantly says that he only has $100,000 available, but promises to collect the remaining $900,000 by tomorrow.
We do have one other problem, and that's Mrs. Parsons. She could still make a lot of trouble for us, even from prison, and I really don't need that.
Well, I think I've solved that problem.
What do you mean?
Let's just say the problem has been buried.
Really?
She's gone, I promise you.
The instant he says those words, Libby opens the door. It was all a trap that she and the officer set together. The officer drew out Nick's confession and recorded it, giving them undeniable proof in Nick's own words. Even now, Nick tries to use the law to save himself.
They're tough in Louisiana, Libby. You shoot me, they'll give you the gas chamber.
No, they won't. It's called double jeopardy. I learned a few things in prison, Nick.
Libby gets him to reveal Maddie's whereabouts. Her son has been placed with a local foster family, but just as the officer prepares to bring Nick to justice, something unexpected happens.
The prosecution rests. You better get out of here. Nobody wants a dead woman walking around when the police are trying to arrest a guy for her murder. Wait a minute. I'll take that gun.
Nick suddenly opens fire, and the situation instantly spirals out of control. The officer throws himself at Nick to protect Libby, and the two men begin fighting, but after being shot, the officer is no match for Nick. Just as Nick raises the gun and aims at the officer, Libby grabs the weapon from the floor and fires twice. Nick collapses. At last, she has brought 6 years of injustice to an end. Although the officer is wounded, he promises to help get Libby cleared of the crime. The mother who was framed 6 years earlier has finally proven her innocence. Several days later, Libby arrives at her son's school. The last time they saw each other was 6 years ago, when Maddie had just turned 5. She is afraid that her son will no longer recognize her. She eagerly walks onto the field and spots the boy she has dreamed about for so long among the crowd. Her eyes instantly fill with tears.
Maddie!
When the boy approaches her, Libby crouches down and speaks in a trembling voice.
Do you know who I am?
They told me you were dead.
No, sweetheart.
They have been separated for 6 years, and everyone has told Maddie that his mother is dead, but the instant he hears her voice, he still recognizes her. Blood ties do not lie, and neither does love. Deep down, young Maddie has been waiting all this time to hear his mother call out to him. He throws himself into her arms. It took this woman, whose life had been destroyed, 6 years to make her way through lies, betrayal, and mortal danger before finally reclaiming her world. 6 years earlier, the law took everything from her. 6 years later, she used a gap in that same law to take back her son with her own hands. This was never really a story about revenge. It was the story of a mother pushed to the brink, proving through the most desperate means imaginable that she would do anything to protect the person she loved. When you have nothing left to lose, you discover that you are far stronger than you ever imagined.